Welcome to the 5th episode of the world's Proven Conspiracies in History. To understand the assassination of Philip II in 336 BC, one must first visualize the sheer blinding magnitude of the moment. It was arguably the most significant wedding in the history of the ancient world, yet the groom was not the king, but a pawn in a much larger game. The setting was Agai, the spiritual and ancestral capital of the Macedonians, nestled in the foothills of Mount Perea. It was October, the air crisp with the coming autumn, but the city was sweltering with the heat of thousands of guests. Every diplomat, general, and satrap from the Greek world and beyond had gathered there. They were not there merely to celebrate the marriage of Philip's daughter, Cleopatra, to her uncle Alexander of Epirus. They were there to witness the apotheosis of Philip II. Philip was 46 years old, and stood at the absolute zenith of his power. He had taken a backwater kingdom of shepherds and goat herders, fractured by tribal warfare and debt, and forged it into the most terrifying military machine the Mediterranean had ever seen. He had crushed the Illyrians, bribed the Thracians, and at the Battle of Chaeronea 2 years prior, he had broken the back of Thebes and Athens. He was the hegemon of Greece, the captain, general of the Hellenic League. His eyes were fixed firmly across the Hellespont, toward the vast, decaying riches of the Persian Empire. The advance force, led by his trusted generals Parmenion and Attalus, was already in Asia Minor, securing bridgeheads. This wedding was his final act of consolidation before leaving Europe to become the king of Asia. But as the wine flowed and the sacrifices burned, a rot was festering at the very heart of his court, a conspiracy born not of geopolitics, but of the most primal human emotions, sexual shame, rejected love, and a mother's terrifying ambition. I am Tsar, educating the common man about famous conspiracies of our history. If you like my content, kindly like, subscribe, and comment. The cast of characters involved in this tragedy reads like a dark Greek drama. At the center was Philip, the one-eyed, limping, battle-scarred warrior king who loved war and wine in equal measure. Opposite him stood his estranged wife, Olympias. She was a Molossian princess, a woman who slept with snakes and claimed to be intimate with the god Zeus. She had been cast aside. A year earlier, Philip had fallen in love with a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. This was not merely a fling. It was a legitimate marriage that threatened Olympias's status and, more importantly, the succession of her son. That son was Alexander, 20 years old, golden-haired, brilliant, and volatile. He had fought by his father's side at Chaeronea, leading the cavalry charge that decimated the sacred band of Thebes, but the relationship between father and son was shattered. At Philip's wedding to the new wife, the bride's uncle, a powerful general named Attalus, had made a drunken toast praying for a legitimate heir to the throne, implying Alexander was a bastard. Alexander had thrown a cup at him. Philip had drawn his sword on his own son, but tripped over his drunken feet. Alexander had sneered, "Look there, the man who makes preparations to pass from Europe to Asia, overturned in passing from seat to seat." Since that night, Alexander and Olympias had been in exile, and though they had returned for this wedding, the air between the royal family was thick with unvoiced threats. But the hand that held the dagger did not belong to a queen or a prince. It belonged to a young man named Pausanias of Orstes. Pausanias was a somatophylax, one of the 7 elite royal bodyguards who slept at the king's door. He was handsome, arrogant, and had once been Philip's lover. In the Macedonian court, pederasty was a social norm, a mentorship that often involved sexual relations. But Pausanias had a rival, another young man also named Pausanias. To distinguish them, the court called the king's lover Pausanias the Beloved. The rival, jealous of the king's favor, had died in a battle against the Illyrians, essentially committing suicide by throwing himself in front of the king to prove his bravery. Before he died, he had confided in Attalus, the same general who had insulted Alexander, that the beloved was a whore who had no honor. Attalus, grieving for his friend, decided to avenge him by destroying the reputation of Pausanias of Orstes. The motive for the conspiracy lies in the horrific event that followed. Attalus invited Pausanias of Orstes to a dinner party. They plied him with unmixed wine until he was senseless. Then Attalus and his muleteers' gang raped the young bodyguard. It was a calculated, brutal destruction of his honor. When Pausanias woke, he went to Philip. He demanded justice. He demanded the head of Attalus, but Philip was in a bind. Attalus was his best general. He was the uncle of his new wife. He was currently commanding the advance force in Asia. Philip could not execute his key commander on the eve of the Persian invasion, so he tried to buy Pausanias off. He gave him gifts, promoted him to the senior bodyguard position, and tried to soothe his wounded pride. But Pausanias did not want gifts. He wanted blood. He realized that the king was complicit in his shame by protecting the rapist. The young man's love turned into a cold, hard hatred. This is where the history becomes murky and the conspiracy deepens. Was Pausanias a lone gunman, driven solely by this personal trauma, or was he a weapon that was picked up and aimed by someone else? The ancient historians, particularly Justin and Plutarch, suggest that Pausanias poured out his grievances to Olympias. She, seeing a weapon to destroy her husband, supposedly encouraged him. She is said to have quoted a line from Euripides' Medea to him, telling him to strike at the father, the bride, and the groom. Some sources even suggest that Alexander was aware of the plot. When Pausanias complained to Alexander about the injustice, the prince reportedly quoted a cryptic line from tragedy about the need for revenge. While there is no smoking gun, the timing was suspicious. Philip was young and healthy. If he had lived another 20 years and had a son with his new pure-blooded Macedonian wife, Alexander's claim to the throne would have evaporated. For Alexander and Olympias, Philip's death at that exact moment was the only thing that could save them. The execution of the plot was planned for the second day of the wedding festivities. The venue was the great theatre of Agai, located just below the palace. At sunrise, the crowds filled the stone seats. The atmosphere was electric. As part of the spectacle, a procession of statues was carried into the theatre. There were 12 statues, intricately carved and adorned with gold, representing the 12 Olympian gods. Then came a 13th statue, equal in size and magnificence to the gods. It was Philip himself. He was declaring his divinity to the world. It was an act of hubris that made the Greeks in the audience shudder. Then came the king. Philip had decided to make a show of his approachability. He wanted to prove he was not a tyrant who needed to hide behind shields. He ordered his bodyguards, including the brooding Pausanias, to hang back at a distance. He walked alone into the orchestra of the theatre, wearing a white cloak, walking between his son Alexander and his new son Law Alexander of Epirus. He was smiling, waving to the cheering thousands. It was the perfect target. Pausanias saw his moment. He broke from the group of bodyguards. He did not run. He sprinted. He reached into the folds of his cloak and drew a Celtic dagger, a short, broad blade designed for close quarters butchery. Before anyone could react, before the cheer could turn to a scream, he was upon the king. He thrust the dagger between Philip's ribs, piercing the heart. The king of Macedon, the conqueror of Greece, fell to the dust without a word. The execution was technically perfect in that the target was eliminated instantly. However, the escape was a disaster. Pausanias had horses waiting at the gates of the city, held by co-conspirators. He turned and ran for the exit. He was fast, and the guards were stunned. He might have made it, but fate, or perhaps the design of the gods, intervened. As he sprinted, his boot caught on a vine root. Some say a vine, others say his sandal strap snapped. He stumbled and fell. 3 of the king's bodyguards, Leonatus, Perdiccas, and Attalus, not the general, but a courtier, were close behind him. They did not try to arrest him. They did not try to take him alive for questioning to find out who else was involved. They fell upon him with their spears and hacked him to pieces. The death of the assassin sealed the conspiracy in silence forever. With Pausanias dead, no one could prove that Olympias or Alexander had put him up to it. The immediate aftermath was a master-class in political maneuvering. Alexander did not weep. He did not hesitate. He was acclaimed king by the army on the spot. His first act was to bury his father with honors, but his second act was a purge of terrifying efficiency. He needed to secure his throne, and that meant removing any alternative focal point for loyalty. The most urgent threat was Attalus, the general in Asia who had insulted him. Alexander sent a death squad across the Hellespont with orders to assassinate him. Attalus was executed for treason he had not yet committed. Then Alexander turned to his cousin, Amyntas Roman IV, the true heir whom Philip had displaced years ago and had him killed. But the most gruesome vengeance was reserved for Olympias. While Alexander was securing the army, Olympias took control of the palace. She seized Philip's young wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, and her infant daughter, Europa. According to the historian Pausanias, Olympias forced the mother to watch as she burned the baby alive in a bronze vessel. She then offered Cleopatra a noose, a dagger, and a cup of poison, telling her to choose her exit. Cleopatra hanged herself. When Alexander returned and found out what his mother had done, he was furious, not out of pity, but because it made him look like a butcher. But the deed was done, the rivals were dead, the path was clear. The historical importance of this assassination cannot be overstated. It is the single pivot point of ancient history. If Philip had lived, the invasion of Persia would certainly have happened, but it would have looked very different. Philip was a pragmatic man. He likely would have conquered Asia Minor, perhaps liberated the Greek cities of Ionia, and forced the Persian king to cede territory. He would have created a lasting Macedonian empire in the eastern Mediterranean, but Philip was worn out. He had old wounds, he drank heavily, and he was a man of the old world. Alexander was something else entirely. He was driven by a pathological need to surpass his father and achieve the impossible. Because Pausanias's dagger found its mark, the world got Alexander the Great. The assassination unleashed a torrent of energy that would not stop until it reached India. It spread Hellenistic culture from Egypt to Afghanistan, creating a cultural fusion that would eventually pave the way for the Roman Empire and Christianity. The death of Philip ended the era of the city-state and began the era of the global empire. The outcome for the witnesses was largely silence or promotion. The bodyguards who killed Pausanias, Leonatus, and Perdiccas became two of Alexander's greatest generals. They were rewarded with commands and riches. Their quick action in silencing the assassin suggests to many modern historians that they might have been part of the Alexander conspiracy, knowing that Pausanias had to die before he could talk. As for the thousands of guests in the theater, they became the first subjects of the new king. The terror of the assassination bound them to Alexander. They had seen the old lion fall and the young lion rise, and they knew that to survive they had to follow the new order. For centuries, this story was debated by historians, treated as a mix of fact and legend. Was Pausanias really abused? Did Olympias really help him? But in the late 20th century, the earth of Macedonia gave up its secrets, providing physical facts that make the story undeniable. In 1977, the Greek archaeologist Manolis Andronikos began digging in the great tumulus at Vergina, the modern name for Aigai. He found an unlooted tomb, now known as Tomb Roman II. Inside, the sights were breathtaking. There was a golden larnax, a chest for ashes embossed with the 16 rayed Vergina sun, the symbol of the royal house. Inside the larnax were charred bones wrapped in purple cloth and gold. But the true evidence lay in the forensic analysis of those bones and the armor found with them. The Greaves' leg armor found in the tomb were mismatched. The left greave was significantly shorter and shaped differently than the right one. This perfectly matched the physical description of Philip Roman II, who had suffered a devastating lance wound to his leg years earlier that had left him with a limp and a deformed tibia. Furthermore, the skull found in the larnax bore the scars of a life of war. There was damage to the right eye socket, consistent with the historical record that Philip lost his right eye to an arrow during the siege of Methone 18 years before his death. The forensic anthropologists confirmed the age of the deceased to be between 40 and 50, exactly Philip's age, while some scholars have argued that the tomb might belong to Philip Roman III, a hideous Alexander's half, brother. The weight of the evidence, the leg armor, the eye wound, the richness of the grave goods, and the date of the pottery points heavily to Philip Roman II. We also have the theater itself. You can go to Vergina today and stand in the exact spot where Philip fell. The stones of the drainage ditch where Pausanias tripped are still there. It is a haunting place, a small, intimate theater compared to the later giants like Epidaurus. Standing there, one can measure the few yards between the royal box and the center of the orchestra. It is a distance of seconds. It brings home the reality of the event, how close the greatest man in the world was to his end, and how a single moment of violence, born of a lover's quarrel and a political coup, shifted the trajectory of human civilization forever. The assassination of Philip Roman II was not just a murder. It was the violent birth of the Hellenistic age, and the physical scars of that day are still visible in the broken bones of the king and the ruined stones of his capital. I hope you have enjoyed my content as we explore the world's most bizarre and hidden conspiracies. Your love by liking, sharing, and subscribing means a lot to me, and your comments are always welcome. See you in the next episode of the World of Conspiracies. Thanks for watching.